Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word.
Today we're looking at Numbers 16. We're going to read about Korah's pride and how it's punished by the Lord. This is going to be another tough chapter. Nearly 15,000 people are killed, and it might strike us as extreme as we read this, but I think that when we understand the context, we'll understand a little bit more of what's going on. So as we go to this chapter, let's remember the context. For one thing, we are in the book of Numbers, and Numbers is, like we said a couple days ago, that mixture of law, historical account, and even some census. And so Numbers chapter 1 tells us that there are 600,000 soldiers, a part of the nation of Israel, so we can imagine far more people would have been included in the total number of the people of God there. In Numbers chapter 12, we saw that Aaron and Miriam had rebelled against Moses, but the Lord had dealt with that situation. Then in Numbers 13, the people themselves rebelled against the Lord. They wouldn't go into the promised land, and they kind of put their foot down and said, no, we're not going to go in because the people are gigantic. We're afraid of them. And since they demonstrated they were not going to trust the Lord or be followers of him, in Numbers 14, the Lord tells them that none of the adults would enter the promised land. And they would wander the wilderness for 40 years until they had all perished. So now we're seeing the winnowing of God's hand at work in this situation. We don't know how much time has passed between Numbers 13 and 14 and Numbers 16, but clearly the people have a smoldering resentment against Moses in their heart, and so they begin a coup, which is just amazing because of how badly things went in Numbers 14 when they tried to take matters into their own hands. They're just batting 1,000 with disobedience to the Lord and suffering his judgment. And so in Numbers 16, a guy named Korah and 3 other men with him mount a rebellion against Moses. Korah was a descendant of Levi. These other men were descendants of Reuben, which was, you might remember, Jacob's firstborn son. And so in that culture, because they were descendants of Jacob's firstborn son, perhaps they felt they had right to lead as well. So verse 1 tells us that these men took action. Now, it wasn't a godly action, it wasn't a righteous action, but they took action. They took action that was rooted in sinful pride. They resented what had been happening. They had left Egypt. They had been wandering now for well over a year, maybe even longer. They had seen God work miraculously, but they still were under his judgment. And so they were resenting Moses and Aaron, and this resentment just boiled within them, and it got the best of them, and they decided to take measures into their own hands. And so in verse 2, they gathered 250 men of renown. These were men that were chosen as leaders, recognized as leaders. These were men of influence. And they come to Moses and Aaron, and they bring 3 complaints in verse 3. Basically, Moses has done enough damage. It's time for somebody to stop Moses from just bringing them over the cliff. 2, Moses, you're not so special. We're all holy, and God is in the midst of all of us. And so they're flattering the masses and saying, Moses, you're not just so special if you're exalting yourself above us. In reality, they were projecting their pride onto Moses. When you think about what they were saying, we've got this great walk with God ourselves. And of course, it's fake. There's no way the Lord was leading them to do anything that they're doing. But since they didn't have an actual walk with the Lord, they just assumed that Moses was making all this stuff up. So this challenge of Moses is really exalting their own fake inspiration. They have a high view of themselves. They figure Moses is making it on up, and they could probably do a better job of making it up. And the net result is they're actually lowering the people's view of true inspiration. They were projecting onto Moses their pride, and they were just demonstrating they had no walk with the Lord. Well, in verse 4, Moses, who does walk with the Lord, responds by falling on his face. He doesn't respond with an angry hostility like they had. He just responds with this humility. Perhaps they're even annoyed by this obvious display of humility that doesn't fit their narrative at all, because he was supposed to be this prideful guy, but he's coming across as quite humble. And so in verse 5, Moses proposes a solution. Let the Lord decide who is going to represent him. And so in verse 7, Moses tells them to go get their censers and bring them before the Lord. Now, this mention of censers here ought to remind us of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10 who brought that strange fire before the Lord and were destroyed for it. You would think they would have learned from that situation that you just can't go before the Lord any old way, but they didn't. And so they go and get their censers. And just to remind you, censers were bronze vessels, kind of almost like sometimes they're like looking like little pots or almost like ornaments or something like that with holes in them so that there was coal inside that would burn and just produce a lot of smoke. And so they were to bring these censers before the Lord and see which one God accepts. Moses reminds them in verse 8 of their calling and their privilege as God's servants. He's astonished that they would want more clout and more honor. They already have such honor, such a privilege to serve the Lord. Why are they creating this division and trying to heap on more glory for themselves? Well, as the story progresses in verse 12, Moses calls for Dathan and Abiram, and they're like, we're not going to come on out. We don't want to deal with you. We don't want to face you. And so they just kind of continue to insult him from a distance. And so they all decide to settle this the next day. And the next day, in verse 18, they go and get their fire pans or their censers ready, and they stand at the doorway of the tabernacle. Verse 19, the glory of the Lord appears, and it's clear that God's judgment is about to come upon all of them. And so again, in verse 22, Moses intercedes for all the people. Just, bring judgment upon these leaders, but not the whole congregation. And so that's what the Lord does. In verse 31, the ground splits open. Korah and these other guys, they all fall into it. Verse 35, fire comes out and destroys the 250 other leaders who were gathered with them. You got this crazy, chaotic scene going on. You can imagine the fear and terror as the people can't believe what they have just seen. Well, later in verse 38, the censers were holy to the Lord because they had been used for worship. And so they made them into kind of this bronze plating for the altar. And then verse 40 gives us the gist for this whole passage. It says that as a reminder to the sons of Israel, that no layman who is not of the descendants of Aaron should come near to burn incense before the Lord, so that he will not become like Korah and his company, just as the Lord had spoken to him through Moses. And so just this idea that especially back then, no layman should burn incense before the Lord. This was for the sanctified, set-apart sons of Aaron, the tribe of Levi. But it gets back to the question, who's in charge? How do we even have this religious system that we're following? Was it made by man or is it made by God? Who's in charge with what we do? God or me? And if God's in charge, I will do what he says. If I'm in charge, I'll do whatever I like. And so here we're seeing what happens to those who say, I'm in charge. Those who say me or I'm in charge, they're not going to enter the promised land. And slowly we're going to see that judgment and death is going to come upon these people. Now, you would think that this event would be over right here, but it's not. We still got verse 41. And so in verse 41, the crowds come back to Moses and they grumble against him and Aaron. And they say, you are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people. Interesting that they say these were the Lord's people. They still have this high view of Korah and the people. They think those were godly people, Moses, and you're the one who brought their destruction. For what it's worth, that side comment there shows us the accuracy of these statements. Because in a way, if we read this, we might wonder the same thing. Like, is Moses just like doing something that's killing these people and he's just saying that's the Lord? The fact that Moses includes this accusation here is because it's just what happened. All the details are what happened. The guys getting destroyed with the ground opening up, the fire destroying the other guys. And Moses is recording it, and even when the people are challenging him about that, saying, you did it, he's putting that in Scripture because he's telling us what actually happened. And so, since these people have such a high view of Korah, they need to be dealt with because the Lord is trying to bring people into submission to him because they have to teach their children how to rightly follow the Lord. So when the children go into the promised land, they will be obedient people of God. And so in verse 45, God's judgment is kindled against the people. In verse 46, Moses has Aaron quickly go to the altar and get some coals and put it in a censer and bring it before the Lord. Remember, that's the altar where the atonement sacrifices were being offered. And so this quick, frantic running to the altar is just showing that they're trusting in God's ways to provide forgiveness and healing and atonement. And so in verse 47, Aaron does this, and he stands in the midst of the assembly, and there's a check on the plague and the judgment of God. 14,700 people died in that, as well as those who died in Korah's rebellion. So it's a tough chapter. What's the takeaway with this? Well, for one thing, this is a key event in the history of Israel. And it's important for us to understand these milestones because these were galvanizing events that showed that the people had to follow God completely. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 10, kind of alludes to this passage where it calls us to not grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction. And so, if nothing else, we can see that there's a warning in this passage for us not to be grumblers. Likewise, we can also see that we cannot play games with God. In Galatians 6:7, it says that God is not going to be mocked, and we shouldn't play games with our faith, with our doctrine. We can't just make things up. What we do and how we worship the Lord has to come from him. Likewise, we're seeing here that during these foundational days of the history of Israel, they incurred severe judgment. Again, this was establishing the foundation for the entire nation to be built upon. The Messiah was going to come through these people if they were not willing to obey. If they were not willing to surrender their will to the Lord, they were going to face his judgment, and that's what we're seeing here. Along those same lines, we're seeing that the men of renown bear an even greater responsibility. These men in verse 1 took action, but it wasn't righteous action. And when we think about our own lives, we need to think about the actions that we might take. Are we doing things that are righteous actions done in a righteous way? That's something we should ask the Lord every day. Along those lines, we also need to be on guard against bitterness in our soul. Hebrews 12:15 warns us about allowing for a root of bitterness to well up in our soul, and that's what you're seeing here, and you're seeing what it produces. And we need to be on guard against bitterness in our heart. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we are seeing the principle of representation or mediation. In a way, we all have a representation before the Lord. Here in this passage, Korah and his ilk are representing the people of Israel. In verse 41, you have these vocal complainers also representing the people of Israel. And since they were in this state of sin, they were bringing judgment upon all of the people whom they represented. And in these early days, again, God is cleansing this rebellion so that they won't continue to have influence upon the people. Conversely, Moses and Aaron also represent the people before the Lord. Moses and Aaron represent a heart to obey the Lord, to recognize he is God and to submit to him. And because they stood before the Lord on behalf of the people, he recognized their representation and spared the people. And so this causes us to ask the question, who represents me before God? If we are Christians, if we are Christ's people, then he represents us. He was accepted by the Lord as proven by his resurrection on the third day. He was validated by the Lord and exalted to the heavenly places. And so he is our representative, he is our advocate who is standing on our behalf so that the judgment that we deserve doesn't come upon us. And if we don't have Jesus as our representative, then we're just under God's judgment. And maybe we won't experience something like the ground opening up and swallowing us, but still there's the fate of hell that awaits all of those who have no mediator, no representative of righteousness who stands before God on their behalf. So I understand this is another tough passage. It's a key passage, though. If you have struggles with this passage, if you're going to end this time in prayer, go ahead and bring those struggles before the Lord. I encourage you to surrender them to him and let him transform your heart and mind through the continued study of his word. And if you don't have any troubles, if you just see this as an awesome display of God's power and glory, why don't you spend a few minutes just praising him, because we have a great and awesome and righteous God. And with that, I hope you have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. God bless.